Hello friends, welcome to the world of English literature. We have been discussing The Adventure by Jayant Narlikar, which is prescribed for class 11. This is chapter 7 from the text Hornbill. My name is Amit and with me is Dr. Asher Jesudos.
Hi. Hello.
We have already done 2 parts of this chapter. Today we will be discussing the questions of this chapter. But very quickly, to go through what we have gone through in the past 2 sessions. It's a very interesting story, a science fiction story, speculative fiction by a scientist who's written about a historian by Jayant Narlikar, who is also a Padma Bhushan, a very decorated scientist who is also a writer. So this story is about, as we've already seen, Professor Guy Tonde, who somehow travels to an alternate reality, not to the past, not to the future, but to an alternate reality where strange things happen to him. And this story is also very funny because it pokes fun at academicians and their penchant or their obsession to speak at public forums and all that as well. But the story is largely about exploring the idea of alternate reality, alternate universe, which we have discussed in great detail in the last 2 parts. So we will have a look at the questions at the end of the chapter in this session. Also to remind you that what we have in our NCERT textbook is an abridged version. And the longer version, which you will get on the internet, of which we have provided a URL already, is much more interesting, and you should go through the entire text to relish it very well. But in this session, we will discuss the questions which are at the end of the chapter. So welcome, Asher.
Thanks, Dr. Amit Ranjan.
Let's start with true and false to recapitulate.
The story is an account of real events.
False. Like I said, it's speculative fiction, so it is it's made up. So it's not real events; it's fiction.
At some point, we'll talk about reality and what reality is, but sure, we'll take that answer. Second question, the story hinges on a particular historical event.
That is true. It hinges on the third battle of Panipat.
Okay. All right. You remember quite a bit of this text.
Kind of.
Rajendra Deshpande was a historian.
False. He was a scholar of mathematics. So Professor Guy Tonde had been conned into speaking about catastrophe theory. Even though he's an historian, he was invited to speak about physics, and so he goes to Deshpande to get an idea of what this catastrophe theory is about.
Okay, good, not bad. Number 4, the places mentioned in the story are all imaginary.
That's also false. The places are real. There's Pune, there's Bombay, there's Peshawar. They're all real places that are mentioned.
And also all the suburbs within Pune and Mumbai.
Yeah,
they've shifted, but
very detailed
right.
description.
Right. The story tries to relate history to science.
That is true, even though it's contentious, but this story is about an interaction between history and science. What if the third battle of Panipat had gone the other way? So there's scientific speculation about historical events, so this statement is true.
All right, so now let's look at the next set of questions. I'll be reading out some statements, and then we can discuss, what our idea of those statements are.
Sure.
Right? So the first one is, you neither traveled to the past nor the future, you were in the present experiencing a different world.
That's one of the most interesting parts of the story. It's a statement of the story, let's say.
Okay.
So generally science fiction has people traveling into future or traveling into past. That is how most science fiction is, like Time Traveler's Wife, the husband travels to the past. Kate and Leopold, which you remember from the last time, there's a modern girl who travels to the past in 19th century, and similarly we've had fascination for traveling into the future to see what future robotics, future galaxies would be like. But here the position is, what is being posited is travel to a different alternate universe, that there are different universes in which simultaneously different kind of things are happening depending on one turnaround moment, which in this case is the third battle of Panipat. So if the third battle of Panipat had gone some other way, if the Marathas had won the war, what would India have been like is the alternative reality which this story posits.
Right, and it also brings the interesting question of what reality is in the first place, because according to quantum physics and the quantum theory, you can have multiple realities existing at the same time, and in this in this fictional narrative of the catastrophe theory, what is posited is that Professor Gaitonde actually traveled to a different reality, right? So what is reality? That becomes an underlying theme in the
I think we'll
entire.
get to that in a
Right.
bit. There are questions relating to reality as well.
Yes, yes. However, I mean, what I'm saying is that instead of the past and the future, we're looking at a different reality in the present. That is,
Exactly, an alternate universe.
right,
Yeah.
an alternate universe. Okay, the next one. You have passed through a fantastic experience, or more correctly, a catastrophic experience. So, would you like to shed some light on the word catastrophe in the first place?
Sure, both the words, fantasy and catastrophe. So, a fantastic experience is something which you don't experience normally, which is in your fantasies, a fairyland, Alice in Wonderland, things like that.
Yep.
So, what Gaitonde has experienced is fantastic, but Deshpande says that it's not fantastic, it's actually more correctly catastrophic experience. Now, the general sense of catastrophe is some disaster, something horrible that has happened. Let's say a bomb blast is a catastrophe, an earthquake, a volcano.
Tsunami.
But tsunami. But the word catastrophe as well, and this will help you in future as well. If you break it down to its Latin root, it's cata and strophe. So words that involve cat are about breaking down. So if you would have read in science catabolism and anabolism, catabolism is breaking down in metabolism of enzymes and so on and so forth. Similarly, catastrophe is a breakdown, a turnaround of events. So it's not essentially a negative word, it is a turnaround of the status quo, of how things are. Suddenly if things flip, say COVID has flipped the world, it is a catastrophe. There's been turnaround in the way we behave, we have to wear masks, etc.
Right.
So catastrophe is something in which the world's current position changes dramatically.
Right. So I was just reminded of my physics classes and chemistry classes of anions and cations. So
Right.
so again, cat has always had a negative connotation. So in the regular sense, if you look up the dictionary, you'll find that catastrophe actually means a disaster, a really bad experience, or something negative. But that is not the catastrophe we're talking about here in this chapter, because here we're looking at the scientific term called which is related to the catastrophe theory.
It is a turnaround of
Right,
events.
which comes from the singularity theory. So essentially, what they're saying is that
Singularity theory.
the singularity theory, which basically means that anything, you take any object like this piece of paper, it has an x-axis and a y-axis and then a z-axis, right? So there are variables, right? A singularity is something which does not have variables, which only has one point, which is the same in x, y, and z, right?
For example, this paper would be singularity, but it is not. Even though it looks like it has no thickness, it does have thickness.
It does have some thickness, but if you assume that it does not have a thickness,
Okay.
even then it still has two variables. One is length and one is breadth. But if it did not have that, it would be a singularity. If it had no length, no breadth, no height.
So what is the theory?
So that is where catastrophe comes in. So when any object is not singular, which most things around us are not singular, right? There are variables. So x is a variable, y is a variable, z is a variable. You've got theorems and equations around that in mathematics. So the moment the variables come in, each of these variables can change the outcome. So for example, if I were to fold this along one axis, then obviously the other axis is also getting affected. I cannot make one change without affecting other things, right? So that is what they're talking about. Like in real life situations, like I keep coming back to this example of two dogs fighting, where how do you explain when two of them are fiercely fighting and one of them suddenly decides to run away? And they take that example at the beginning of this chapter. So what are those factors that vary and influence that dog to run away? So that is the catastrophe that we're talking about. So it's not the regular definition of catastrophe, which is like a disastrous event.
Let's simplify it further for our because they may be humanities students.
Right.
So there are proverbs like one lie leads to 1,000 lies. So once you have
Right.
shaken the system of truth out of control, you lie once, you'll have to lie 100 times to get the system back in control, and it never gets back in control. And so one small difference in the system can shake it up. That is what singularity theory, the butterfly effect, talks about, how a butterfly can cause a volcano eruption.
In the right
Like,
circumstances.
In the right circumstances, at the right place, at the wave that originates from the flapping of the butterfly and lead to a further wave which shakes up the molten lava within, and it erupts.
It reminds me of another saying, a stitch in time saves nine. So it's the other way, like we do something positive.
Yeah.
And it also kind of gives us the message, the story gives us the message that you make, if no matter how small you are, now no matter how insignificant you think you are, you have the power to make a great change. You know, so if you
Absolutely.
want to make changes, you can start with.
So we should
little
not
things.
despair that
Should not,
that we
absolutely.
are too small. What will happen with my little effort? A lot happens
A lot
with
can
little
happen.
effort.
It reminds me of the story of the starfish as well. Yeah.
Okay.
But that's
Let's
for
go on.
another time. Yeah. Gangadhar Pant could not help comparing the country he knew with what he was witnessing around him.
Yeah, because Gangadhar Pant in the story first is in independent India, which is after 1947, in which India has been partitioned, the British have left, but the place he lands up in, Bombay, is still in British control, very much like Hong Kong was in British control until for 99 years. While Peshawar is a part of India, so India has not been divided in this alternate universe. So he has to kind of compare this weird situation, which should have been in history, but is in his present.
Right. So it's interesting how, you know, concepts of nationality, like what is a nation, come into question here, because in the alternate reality, present day Pakistan in this reality is a part of India. But Bombay, which is very much the heart of India, as we call it, you know, the
Commercial capital.
commercial capital, the cultural capital, heart of Bollywood, is not, and it's retained by the British. Also, the scientific developments that they talk about, you know, that's very interesting, because one argument that we constantly hear is that, you know, the British brought in technology to India. And you know, if the British weren't here, we'd be technologically not very advanced. But in this alternate reality, they show that the Peshwas realized the potential of the scientific revolution that was happening in Europe, and what they did as a result was they adopted all these technological changes. And what happened as a result was that India, in this alternate reality, turned out to be much more advanced than the real India that, as we know it, that Gaitonde stepped out of. You know, so you know the Polaroid
So
size.
what Gaitonde is saying, or what the narrator of the story is trying to posit here, is that the British colonialism was bad for Indian economy, that it was a lot of exploitation, and that people say that if the British had not come, then we would probably not have had the railways or things like that. But what the narrator of this story is telling is that there was a force of history across the world, and that development would touch every part of the world irrespective of whether you were a colony or not, like Japan, like many other places in the world which were not colonies and became highly developed. So they are trying to, through the speculative fiction, trying to show that colonialism is not a priori, is not the condition for development of India.
Absolutely. So let's move to the next
Sure.
statement. The lack of determinism is in quantum theory. What do you have to say about that?
Determinism is a philosophical idea where the idea is that everything is determined, is predetermined. That there are pieces of the jigsaw puzzle which fit in exactly. The future is ordained, and certain actions will have certain kinds of consequences. Whereas quantum theory from physics, as we've been discussing, talks about relativity, talks about relation of various subatomic particles and how that affects the larger reality. So once again, we have discussed Heisenberg's uncertainty principle in the last chapter, which says that if you know the position of an electron, you cannot know its velocity. If you know its velocity, you cannot know the position. So both these are not determinable, and which has further ramifications in a larger universe. That if you know that everything is not knowable completely knowable, that puts you in a strange kind of a situation where you're not sure, where you're no longer sure about the world.
I think it also has a very good motivational message for me, because there are three examples that I'd like to cite. So the first example that he says is, when you fire a bullet from a gun, you can determine exactly where the bullet is going to travel through some equations and predictions.
Sure.
Planets revolving around the sun, similarly, you can predict, right? And when you look at objects like these, there are these philosophical theories that come in which say that everything is in motion, everything is kind of predetermined, and nothing can change. Everything has been set, and they kind of put that upon us as well, that your life has been already written. The script of your life has been written. You cannot change anything. You just have to go through the motion. However, when you look at subatomic particles like the electron, through several experiments, we've known now that it is impossible to predict exactly where an electron will be, and sometimes it's inexplicable. It can be anywhere at any time. I mean, you can only say the odds of where an electron can be. So if a particle as small as an electron can have its own will, per se, of what it wants to do, and no one can determine that, then imagine you are a living being with so many atoms and so many cells and so many electrons inside.
What the possibilities are.
The possibilities are. So you can change your fate. A lot of people get resigned.
And every small positive change that you make contributes to a much bigger positive change in the society. So that's the message, probably.
And that's the whole concept of the butterfly theory and the catastrophe theory as well, wherein you make these small changes and you never know what the impact of your presence in this world can be.
And so, in a way, science does affect history. The history that we are making today, if we look at it scientifically, if we contribute our small changes in a positive fashion, there will be bigger changes that will happen.
And you as an individual are contributing to history, no matter who you are. Okay, the last one, you need some interaction to cause a transition.
So this is towards the end of the story, where Deshpande is trying to explain to Gaitonde what actually happened. So Gaitonde travels from this universe, this India, to another India, and why did this happen, he's trying to figure out, which is what Deshpande is trying to explain here, that some interaction has to happen to cause a transition, which is that Gaitonde was thinking about the third battle of Panipat and had been thinking about it. And so when the accident happened, so he was in an accident while he was thinking about it, so the neurons in his brain kind of pushed his entire thought process into that direction, his being, his existence into that direction. That's how he landed up in an alternative reality. So that is the interaction that caused that transition.
So that's a brilliant point, how Professor Gaitonde was thinking about those things, and that's what changed, made him transition from one reality to another reality, from one universe to another universe, if you will. And it kind of, for me, the message that it gives is the power of thought. Like, when you're thinking of something, you can actually make changes even in reality around you, right? And a simple example is that, when your facial expressions, your body language, thoughts can change physical reality. Like, when you're happy, when you have happy thoughts, your face shows that you're happy. When you have sad thoughts, your face shows that you're sad. So the power of thought, no matter what situation you're in, again, the positive message here is that if you can change your thoughts, then you can change the reality around you in real life.
Wonderful. Now let us move on to the next section, which is talking about the text, which is supposed to be generally discussed by students as part of debates in pairs, but here we'll give you an overview of what the key points are, and then you can probably discuss it further with your classmates. It's a good exercise. So the first point is, a single event may change the course of the history of a nation.
Right. So here I think they can talk about the two different versions of the Battle of Panipat, the third Battle of Panipat that have been discussed. And the only difference between the two battles is that in one, the bullet hits the Peshwa, but in the second one, it misses by a whisker. And that changes the outcome of the war, and it also changes the outcome of history and how the nation developed, the borders of the country, and so many different things, right? So that is the key point, and then students can relate it to things in their lives, and maybe you could give a couple of examples of how little things could have ended
Sure.
up changing history.
And historians generally engage with this kind of speculative history, what if moments. What if India had not got partition? If we were a big country with a united economy? Many other questions that Indian historians delve into. What if Dara Shikoh had defeated Aurangzeb? There would be a lot of Sufi dervishes and qawwalis everywhere in the air today. It would have been a different reality. What if Rosa Parks had given the seat to the white man? So if you don't know the story, Rosa Parks refused in the United States of America to give her seat to a white person, and that's what led to a huge uprising and the black civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King Jr., and which is what has led to equality in that society, which is still a lot of struggle. But there are many moments in history which could have turned around with just one little incident. In this case, it's the Third Battle of Panipat, in which the Peshwas lost because of one bullet that went wrong. If the Peshwas had won the battle, it would have been different, Narlikar is saying. So it is a general thing in history and literature to discuss these kind of questions, and a very interesting exercise always.
Right, and I think students can also add, besides history, they can talk about things like sports. You know, what if that batsman had scored an extra run?
We always do.
Yeah, so you can include all these discussions. You know, if you find history is very boring, you can include these what if moments from day-to-day life. You know, maybe you were playing a match with the other school. What if I had scored that extra run, or what if I had left that ball alone, or you know, so include all interesting discussions like that. Second one, reality is what is directly experienced through the senses. I find this really interesting.
Yeah.
What is reality?
So there's a very good, interesting tale which is in practically every culture. There are poems about it, stories about it. The elephant and the seven blind men. So somebody touches the ear, somebody touches the trunk, somebody touches the body, and everybody thinks of the elephant as a different animal. And so with our limited sensory perception, we have just 5 senses. We can't listen at the frequency that dogs can listen to. We don't have the kind of smell that many animals have. So we do not know reality in multifarious ways, but only through our limited 5 senses. And so reality is much more. What we think of reality is actually a representation, a perception. That's my take on it.
Right, and there are multiple ways of looking at this, multiple theories. Some people say that you know, you must trust your senses because that is what reality is. Because if you don't have your senses, then you don't have a reality in the first place. But the other way to look at it, so you can have an interesting debate in your class. You can divide your class into 2 sections, and you can say, okay, one section says that our senses are what determine what reality is, and if there were no senses, there would be no reality. But on the other hand, you can say that reality exists irrespective of whether you have senses or not. Like this paper exists, but because I have eyes, I can see the shape of it, the color of it. Now imagine someone who's blindfolded from birth. How do you explain, you can explain the shape because the person can touch it, but how do you explain the color? You know, so what is reality? If we had one more sense besides the 5 senses that we have, would our reality have been different? Are we missing certain things because we don't have enough senses? So what is reality? That is what you need to discuss in your class.
And in these days of social media, it's also important to discuss it from that point of view. That you get multiple WhatsApp forwards, you see things in Facebook, something that is shown to you by again and again. So your sensory perception of seeing and whatever thoughts you have, that gets inflated, and so you may be considering something which is very false, very true. And so one has to be very careful these days to check sources, to cross-check facts, and then understand what the real situation is instead of just believing what you're seeing.
Right.
Seeing may not be believing after all.
It takes us back to the fundamental philosophical question of who am I? What is my reality? You know, so am I my hands, my legs, my body, or am I something larger? So what is reality? That's an interesting topic for debate. A lot of points that we've given you. You can include more points as well. The next one is the methods of inquiry of history, science, and philosophy are similar.
That is very interesting. Now, these are 3 very different subjects, 3 very different disciplines, and in fact 3 different departments when you go to a college. But I would say that the methods of inquiry of all these three converge at some point, which is they are all in pursuit of truth. History is about the truth of past. So you go through archives, you cross-check many references, very detailed, so you compare one book with another and then arrive at what could be the fact, what could be close to fact.
Right.
And so is science. Science is about the truth of nature. We want to understand how things work, what are the laws of motion, what is relativity, and so on. Philosophy is about our nature, human nature. What is life? What is existence? How to lead a life? That is also in pursuit of truth. So somewhere all these three disciplines converge in their search for truth, whereas they are very different in their methodologies.
Right, because science I mean, the scientific method in itself is very objective. Whereas history, on the other hand, is generally written by the person who, like they say, history is the version of the person who won the war, you know. So it's very subjective. Who writes the history determines what history becomes at
It's
times.
a matter of interpretation.
Matter of interpretation, matter of perspective, which is absent in science, where everything is based on experimentation and empirical observation. Philosophy, on the other hand, is abstraction, you know. So there are similarities, there are
follows,
differences. Yes.
A stream of thought, syllogism it's called, logic, a flow of logic. This leads to that. If man has been to the moon, can he go to Mars? It
Okay.
goes into that kind of progression.
The next question. Why do you think, so this is question number 2 now. There are 2 parts to this. The story is called The Adventure. Compare it with the adventure described in We're Not Afraid to Die, which is another chapter in the same book. I think we will not spend too much time here on this, but just a brief summary, not a summary, but an idea of what happens in the other book. There are some people who go out into the sea and the boat capsizes, so it's more like an adventure in the ocean. But the adventure here is more of a philosophical, scientific hypothesis kind of an adventure. So read that book, read that chapter, read this chapter, and then maybe you can do a comparison between the 2 different types of adventure that are happening in both chapters.
Sure.
Right? But the second one, I'd like to throw this to you,
Sure.
Amit. Why do you think Professor Gaitonde decided never to preside over meetings again?
That was his 1000th meeting in which he was insulted and humiliated, thrown into the crowd. That's one reason. But I think the real reason is that he understood that there was no precedent in the 1000th meeting. They believed in a system that has no authority figure. And he understood a new system of governance, a new system of running things.
Which one do you think is better?
That I throw to the students to figure out. What Gaitonde brings in here is a political system of anarchy. Anarchy is a word which is much maligned in today's day. You think that it's complete chaos, but anarchy is a philosophical thought from the 19th century, which talks about a system of governance which is highly decentralized, like the discussion on Panchayati Raj in India, that the more you decentralize power, the more power you give at the grassroots, the more successful governance will be. So it is a metaphorical inquiry into that kind of a system over here.
All right, so interesting points for discussion for the students, and I think with that we can bring this lecture to a close, and we'll discuss the remaining questions in the next one.
Which will have more to do with grammar and form of language and idioms, etc.
Right.
So thanks a lot for being with us, and see you in the next part of the same chapter.